Okay, so at the time of me recording this voiceover, it is currently ticked over to March 30th. Yeah, go ahead and laugh. Dante has been out for a few days now. And listen, I try to avoid, over-exaggerating new frame releases, or at least I like to think so. I mean, I haven't got to the point where I'm making thumbnails with big red circles at the very least. Sure, I'll be enthusiastic with how I speak about a good frame, but I'm not all like, oh, this frame bestest, most best ever, top tier, number one, you know? So, I need you to understand something. The reason why I mentioned the date that current me is living in right now is because by the time you guys see this video, you're likely living in one of two worlds. The one that I'm still living in, or a post-nerf Dante world. And I'm kind of expecting the latter, if I'm being honest, because when I say that I think that Dante is currently the best frame in the game right now, with zero contest, no fucking possible way to convince me otherwise? I do not say that lightly. I need to stress that this is not me pushing YouTuber exaggeration at you. Genuinely, no bullshitting. This frame, as of March 30th, is overtuned to hell. I have seen arguments trying to say that he is fine and is on level with other frames, but no, I simply cannot accept that. When I am capable of constantly achieving 80 to 90% of the damage and kill counts in groups where I am the only Dante, even against the likes of Kalervo, Mesa, Corvex, and Saren, I think something is seriously wrong. Very rarely do I actually advocate for the nerfing of frames, but holy mother of God in Christ, Dante in his current state is a fucking omniversal god in comparison to everyone else right now. It is absolutely bonkers to me that he managed to release in the state that he is in now. So let's flip a coin and see if he's been nerfed since then, and whether I'll have to re-record a chunk of my script. Oh, god damn it. Well, actually, outside of some LOS jank, his nerfs don't affect his potency that much, but it's still enough that I have to do extra work, so thanks, D. I think I'd rather wax my ball hairs than redo things, but whatever. Dante. He's an owl man shaped like an arrow, or a Dorito, whatever your preference may be, and his concept is something that I'm surprised we haven't seen tackled before. A wizard.
Actually, he's a scribe, not a wizard. And the same way that Chroma is a shaman, not a dragon. No!
Seriously, this game is 11 years old at this point, and we're only just now getting to a wizard concept? Granted, we're still sitting on a lot of popular concepts, from time control to arachnid, but yeah, long time coming. And Dante is a very, very silly frame in terms of how ungodly strong he is. Was. As per usual, the passive is up first, and it's one that I quite like actually. Noctua scans targets, recording information for your codex. Status chance increases by 50% on fully scanned targets. So to clarify, whenever you attack an enemy with the Noctua, it counts as a scan towards that target. You aren't just auto-scanning every enemy around you, but still, it's pretty nice. Like, as someone who just cannot be arsed to manually scan with a scanner or use a sentinel to do it for me since, you know, that's my cat slot, it may come as a surprise just how incomplete my codex is, even though I've been playing this game for over 10 years at this point. So this passive was a welcome surprise, but it's also really helpful for new players. Like, I'm pretty sure that this is the first passive that we've got that grants permanent progression progress for other parts of the game, and I am all for that. And hell, it keeps being useful, because you're also given a pretty hefty increase to status chance as well on targets that are fully scanned. So, all in all, fantastic passive. Getting into his actual kit, Noctua is Dante's first power. It functions as an exalted weapon, conjuring a tome that allows you to fling magic missiles and other such fun glowy bits. On primary fire, it causes the projectile to split and seek out more enemies, whilst also filling the secondary fire's gauge. Said meter can also be filled by picking up secondary ammo, though unfortunately, ammo converted with pistol mutation doesn't seem to work the same way. When the meter is filled, you can use the secondary fire to release a giant wave. Weave, which also triggers any tome mods that you may have equipped. Noctua is probably the most unique exalted weapon in the game, and is likely my favorite out of all of them. Not because of its damage potential, though it can be made to hurt quite a bit, but because of the sheer utility that it provides Dante. Being able to use all of the Grimoire's tome mods is a phenomenal perk to have, as it means that this one power can be responsible for granting you a 60% increase to strength, 60% increase to duration, 60% increase to efficiency, 10 energy a second, 12% universal orb drop on enemy kill, 30% fire rate on enemy kill, 5% armor and shield reduction against mobs per kill, 40% shield recharge rate on kill, and negative 28 shield recharge delay on kill. Yeah, so that's a lot of potential there. Over on Twitter when the Grimoire first came out, I mentioned how I really liked that weapon, even though it didn't do very much damage, sheerly because of its attempt at being a utility weapon. The only problem is that it didn't offer enough utility compared to other options for the secondary slot. Like, you'd probably be better off with a kick gun with various arcanes, if I'm being frank. But the Noctua fixed every single issue that I had with the Grimoire. This thing is truly the weapon for those seeking utility over raw damage. It's just a shame that it's locked to a single frame. Like, I honestly think that if you were to take the Noctua's trait and give it to the Grimoire, but keep the Grimoire's damage output weak, that alone would make that secondary far more appealing to use. But hey, I'll take this too. And like I said, you can also just make this a hard-hitting exalted, but for me personally, I focus entirely on fire rate, multi-shot, and then whatever tome mods I want. I don't put any damage on it, just because I love having that boost to strength, duration, and efficiency. But if I'm being honest, it is probably better that you make a hybrid build. I'm just being stupid. Next is Light Verse. On cast, Dante gives himself and allies some overguard, whilst also healing a portion of missing health. It also fills a page for Final Verse. Light Verse on its own is a very simple power. It's pure support. But its potency with Final Verse is absolutely ridiculous, and we'll get to that later. Light Verse was one of the things that made Dante such an overtuned madman purely because of the max overguard that you could reach, and it didn't take very long to reapply it in the slightest. And this isn't even taking Triumph into account, which was also nerfed. Regardless, Light Verse is still a very silly survivability power. And thanks to that, I usually just slap on Adaptation and ignore any sort of HP increasing mods, since it's not very hard to keep on top of your overguard and keep it topped up. So if you were worried that Dante was going to be this stereotypical squishy mage, he is not. Survivability is incredibly easy with this guy. But more than that, he also grants his team overguard, which is arguably an even better part of this power. Seriously, if Dante is in the group, chances are you ain't dying anytime soon. I mean, you wouldn't be dying anyways, because he also radiates a dematerialization aura that also causes any hostiles within a roughly 4,000 kilometer radius to spontaneously be deleted from existence, but, you know, you can never be too safe. Yo, I did that first take. Next up is Dark Verse. Dark Verse causes Dante to mark all enemies within his sight with a sigil that applies 2 instances of slash procs, and this power also adds a page to Final Verse. And again, deceptively simple power, but the devil is in the details. First off, the range. 20 meter base, and is affected by power range. So already, that's pretty solid for a power that's meant to be a primer, but it's not that out of the ordinary yet. But it is enough to give the coverage of the power some really high potential. On my build, I have a 47 meter radius, meaning that I can mark this group as far back as this. And this power also helped me realize that there's something very interesting about line of sight checks in this game. See, I noticed that the line of sight check that this power has was extremely odd and forgiving, and I don't really know what was going on with it, but I swear I was able to mark enemies that were clearly obscured behind an obstacle. So I put on my lab coat and got to testing, upon which I figured out that Dark Verse seems to take into account your camera's view rather than the view that would be coming from Dante. In other words, I can't mark enemies here, but if I adjust my camera to where we can see them, but Dante theoretically wouldn't be able to, we mark them just fine. And at first I was like, okay, maybe I'm stupid and this is how all line of sight powers function, and I just never really noticed. And well, I'm actually only half stupid, because let's just say that I was this many years old when I discovered that not all line of sight checks are created equal. I just didn't notice until now. Some, like Radial Blind and Feast, do check from what I can only assume is the frame's potential line of sight. Others, like Fractal Blast and Peacemaker, do the check from the game's camera, which obviously has a much bigger advantage. So, guess what category Darkverse falls into? So if you've been playing Dante and wondering how the fuck you're marking enemies sometimes but not other times, this seems to be the reason why. Now, I will say that one of the changes that DE has made to this power does involve line of sight, and in fact, they have made changes to LOS across the board. So I'm not actually sure if this is still true or not, but I still felt like it was worth noting. Hey, so I decided to not be lazy, so I'm just popping in to say that, yeah, it seems like the LOS changes have more or less brought all line of sight checks into equality, or at least from what I can tell. So with Grendel, like I showed in a clip a minute ago, he used to have to be able to like see targets from his own eyeballs, but now I can kind of just flick my mouse and get them into view and then bring it down and I can eat them through this fucking wall. And similarly, Excalibur can also blind enemies now as long as you can see them through your camera, whereas before, Excalibur himself needed line of sight, so if I just like blind right here, nothing happens, but if I get my camera like this, we're able to blind them. So yippee! All line of sight tools have gotten better. So I imagine that this info on line of sight checks probably isn't news for many of you, and I'm just late to discovering it myself. Like, how the fuck did I not notice this with things like Peacemaker until now? But hey, better late than never, right? Anyway, back to Darkverse. On its own, it doesn't deal very much damage, but like I said, it's mainly a primer ability. But even on its own, thanks to the absolute ridiculous range it can achieve, it is enough to make low to mid-level missions an absolute cakewalk. Seriously, you can just kind of meander through a non-steel path level 60 mission and mash 3 and Bob's your uncle. And now, ladies and gentlemen and everyone in between, let me introduce you to Final Verse, a very, very solid contender for best power in the game. Or at least it was, but it has since been toned down since the nerfings. Though it still may hold that title because it is still absurdly good for reasons that you'll see soon enough. Final Verse serves as essentially 4 powers in one. Which one you cast is determined by how you fill Final Verse's 2 page slots. As mentioned earlier, upon casting Light Verse or Dark Verse, you fill a slot, and once both slots have been filled, you may cast Final Verse, upon which the slots become empty again. So let's go over all the possible casts. Casting 1 Light Verse and 1 Dark Verse will cause Final Verse to cast Wordwarden, which summons a Phantom Book to yourself and each of your allies, which will attack alongside your own attacks. Wordwarden's damage is determined by how you've modded your Noctua. An undocumented effect that Wordwarden has is that each hit that the Phantom Books land build up your Noctua's secondary fire meter, even if you don't have Noctua summoned in that moment. So if you're like me and want to maintain your tome buffs, Wordwarden is a great passive way to do that. Because yes, you even get charged when your allies' books do damage. The only problem is that Wordwarden only strikes mobs when you attack with weaponry, which is a problem on a frame like Dante because, well, we'll get there. Casting Dark Verse then Light Verse will cause Final Verse to cast Page Flight, summoning 3 spectral owls to swoop down and attack enemies, dealing light damage, making them more vulnerable to status effects, whilst at the same time drawing enemy fire. Page Flight is probably the least useful tool in his kit in my opinion, as a lot of its functions are covered by other parts of his kit. Like, why do you need to redirect fire away from yourself when you have Light Verse giving you all the overcard you could ever ask for? Why do you need status vulnerability when Dark Verse has guaranteed slash procs? Like, yeah, I know that enemies attacked by the owls can make them take more slash procs per input of Dark Verse, but the issue there is that there's only so many mobs that these 3 owls can attack at once, and they aren't particularly fast either. I don't know, to me it just seems like the least useful of the verses. Casting 2 Light Verses will cause Final Verse to cast Triumph, a buff that recovers team health and also grants Overguard. This sounds similar to Light Verse on its own, but Triumph grants much more Overguard and also grants a small buff where any kills during the following seconds after Triumph will regenerate your Overguard. So if you didn't have enough healing and Overguard already, this just gives you more. This was also a big focus of his nerfings because, yeah, the Overguard values that you could reach prior to this change was ridiculous. And again, this power along with Light Verse applies to the entire team, so they reduced the base overguard gain from 5,000 to 2,000. Still more than enough in my opinion, mind you, and you still ain't gonna be dying if Dante is on the team, as long as he has functioning appendages to hit the ability buttons. But something I will say is that it does take way too many casts to reach your maximum OG cap now. Like, come on D, this is really fucking silly. Not much else to say about it besides not dying is fun, I guess? And lastly, the crowning jewel. Casting 2 Dark Verses causes Final Verse to cast Tragedy, upon which any enemies within the area of effect will have their damage over time status effects removed, and all remaining ticks of those removed statuses culminate in one massive blast on the target. This damage is also multiplied based on your power strength. And I know that the central focus of his nerfings were on Triumph, but in my opinion, it was this power that was the biggest thing in need of a nerf, which it did get, although it is still a very fucking good tile clear. So, what was it like before its nerf? Well, first, let's look at the radius. 30 meters. Okay, well, knowing what we know about Warframe, this probably means that the power released with a line of sight check requirement, right? Because, you know, a 30 meter base is a lot. So, yeah, it had one, right? No? Yeah, this ability, which I have gotten to 70 meters, mind you, had no line of sight check. And oh my fucking god, I cannot stress how stupid that this allowed you to play. Remember how I said that you could just run through low-level missions with Dark Verse? Well, I actually withheld some information from you. You can actually run through those missions, casting Dark Verse and not even caring if you marked enemies, because Final Verse Tragedy does damage even to enemies not inflicted with statuses. Now, I'll be fair here and say, at low enough levels, most primer-reliant damage powers can kill low levels even without priming. I mean, who cares, right? It's only low-level content. But if you think this thing is only useful in low levels, here's me farting on level 160 Steel Path Bombards like they're nothing! Yes! Not even heavy units can stand up to this fucking thing! This power has nearly zero setup time, a 30-meter AoE radius that is so strong it's capable of one-tapping high-level Steel Path heavies, and it used to not have a line of sight check on it! All of this on a frame with a give everyone invincibility button! Now look, elephant in the room. Yes, Dante isn't the only nuke frame who can ignore line of sight. In fact, a fair number of frames do it now, but let me try to explain why Dante's case, I feel, was particularly overtuned. So it primarily comes down to two things. One, Dante is already a supportive god, capable of turning any team into immortals. Seriously, he stands shoulder to shoulder with Wisp, Octavia, and Trinity in my opinion. What he lacks in offensive support, he makes up for in spades in defensive support. Second, Dante's nuke capabilities have very few restrictions on them. So with those two factors in mind, let's take a look at some other frames and compare. First, Corvex. I still maintain that this brick of a man is one of the best nukers in the game, and in fact he shares many of Dante's nuking characteristics. Little to no setup time? Check. Massive range that ignores obstacles? Check. Capable of burning down even Steel Path heavies? Oh, very much check. But he does have two flaws. First, his damage relies on enemy quantity. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but in my opinion, it is. Because it restricts Corvex's max potential to pretty much just Steel Path Endless missions where spawns are multiplied. He can put out solid damage outside of the scenarios, but he won't be nuking heavies nearly as fast as Dante can. And also, crucially, he lacks the supportive capabilities of Dante. For another example, Lavos. He has a phenomenal nuke tool with giga range and fantastic damage potential, but there's a lot of caveats. The damage relies on status effects being on the mobs that are hit by it, and despite being a 360-degree AoE tool, Lavos lacks tools that can apply statuses within that entire radius. All of his primer tools are just cones and lines, so his damage coverage will pretty much always be gaps. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? That's exactly Dante's case. He needs statuses on enemies for his nuke, and that nuke also has a 360-degree radius, but Dante himself can only prime in cones. And while that's definitely true, Lavos comes with many more hindrances. For one, he has a massive cooldown on his 4, which This still needs to be reduced. Like, with the frames that exist now, give me a fucking break. I said on release that this cooldown needed to be reduced, and each day that passes, I feel more and more correct. Anyway, Dante also has a much easier time applying his statuses since he isn't restricted to cooldowns, and Dark Verse outclasses pretty much all of Lavos' primer tools in either coverage, range, or both. And, again, to stress this, Lavos also lacks the absurd support capabilities that Dante has. And I mean, there's plenty of other frames: Garuda, Saren, Volt, Equinox, Kalervo, Sevagoth. The lack of LOS on damage isn't anything new. The thing that sets Dante apart is that his nuke tool has some of the fewest restrictions in the game, and on top of that, he was given top-of-the-line support capabilities, and it's that combination that has made this frame so silly. And look, yes, I know you need a primer to get the most out of it, but his primer is in the upper echelon of all primers in the game. It is ridiculously fast, I mark enemies that I don't even fucking see, and has a massive base radius. Tragedy, having a range of 70 meters and not having a line of sight check on release, was just overkill. Like, for as strong as Kalervo is, he still needs enemies to be somewhat grouped. For as silly as Corvex's Pillar Blasts are, they aren't strong enough to consistently take out heavies, and they have to be consistently moved around. For as hands-off as Saren's Spores are, at least their damage ramp-up takes time, and it goes through resets. Tragedy was a ridiculous power. Why can it have 70 meters on it? Why does setting up its primer take like 1 second with just a few lemon-flavored rock candies? Why did it not have line of sight on release? You know my last video on Loki when I was saying how damage frames have been able to deal their damage faster and faster nowadays? This is a perfect reinforcing example of that. Okay, but like I said, it has since been nerfed. A check is now executed upon casting Tragedy, and the overguard obtained from Triumph has been reduced. But is that enough to erase my opinion that he is the best in the game? Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. But for me, he's still easily top 5. Dante is fucking out of this world, even more so pre-nerf. He can't be killed thanks to his ridiculous overguard potential. He can single-handedly keep the entire team alive. He has a nuke so hard-hitting that it makes Steel Path heavies weep. 160 strength, by the way. He has almost zero setup time on said nuke. He was able to breeze through any low-level mission faster than almost anyone else prior to Tragedy's nerf. He has some of the quickest priming in the game, and he has by far the highest range potential out of all damage-dealing frames. Like I said in the beginning, I severely doubt anyone could have changed my mind when I said that Dante had taken the crown of just overall best frame in the game. After the nerfs, that's harder to say. And he does still have some areas that he's lacking in. One example is high single target damage output. So yeah, you could bring something better than him against Eidolons or Profit Taker or whatever, but those were very niche areas. Anywhere else, however, I struggle to think of why I wouldn't want to take this arrow-shaped Owlman. Now, Quill, you excuse me, I have to book it. I'm being paged about something important, though I doubt it's anything novel. Don't worry though, I'll be back soon enough.